From an individual's perspective, human capital has an enormous effect on that person's quality of life and that person's standard of living. There is clearly the direct effect of length of life and health. So, a longer life gives a person more time to enjoy life. Health also directly affects a person's quality of life, standard of living, because, well, for example, living without pain is better than living with pain. Living with impaired health is worse than living with health that is good. There is also another effect. For most of us, our earnings from labor, whatever we earn by working, are by far the largest source of income. And these really are returns on your human capital because they depend on your ability to work, which in turn depends on your health and your skills. From a social perspective, there are many factors that affect the productivity of a society. It turns out that societies whose productivity mainly depends on the human capital of their populations tend to do better in terms of standards of living, in terms of rights for their people, than societies that depend in particular on natural resources. This is sometimes called the resource curse. So, this is a contrast with what we were talking about earlier. And this is the phenomenon that in most countries which have large amounts of natural resources, in particular, this applies to petroleum or a few other minerals that can be mined and sold easily on world markets, the ruling classes in these countries, they rely on those natural resources, those extractable natural resources for their money, for their funding. And the ruling classes in these countries tend to focus less on their people's health and education, and as a consequence, for most people, standards of living and human outcomes, things like health, things like education, are worse than in societies that depend on their people's productive capability, the human capital of their people, in order to be productive. Examples of countries that depend on people's human capital, that are resource poor in the sense of natural resources but have become wealthy, those include many of the so-called East Asian tigers. In contrast, there are many countries that are rich in mineral resources, including especially petroleum, that have relatively poor outcomes for their people because the focus in those countries is on the extraction of those natural resources.